All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining. It looks like we still have some people joining us in the waiting room. So I'm going to multitask for a second and admit people as I talk. But welcome to Elder Abuse Prevention and Intervention through a Trauma-Informed Response. So excited to be hosting this webinar this year with CHANA. I'll have Jackie Shorter introduce herself in a second. This is our second year working together to honor World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, which is next week on June 15th. So just some webinar logistics. I'll get those over with before we get started. Please keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. We definitely want to hear from you all and hear your questions and your comments, but please put those in the chat box. The copy of this recording and this PowerPoint will be sent out after the presentation. If you are looking to get social work CEUs for this presentation, it does offer 1.5 Category 1 social work continuing education credits. You want to make sure that the name on Zoom is the name that you registered with and your full name, so I'm able to recognize that you joined, and you must be present for the entire live webinar. Following the presentation, you will get a link to an evaluation where you can request your certificate. Certificates will be emailed out within about 2 weeks of the webinar, probably a little bit sooner. I'm giving myself some leeway there. And if you have any questions about that process, please feel free to email me. So I am going to turn it over to Jackie to introduce yourself and your program. Thanks, Jackie.
Hi, everybody. It's really great to be with all of you again, and so grateful to Sydney for us to be able to co-facilitate this training in commemoration of World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. I work at CHANA. I'm the Director of Elder Abuse Awareness. I'm an elder abuse educator and consultant, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker with a certificate in gerontology, and I'm a trained volunteer long-term care ombudsman. I train locally, statewide, nationally, both in person and virtually. And CHANA started our elder abuse services in 2013. We've been in operation as an organization since, for about 27 years. And as you can see on my slide, we provide intervention, prevention, advocacy, and consultation services. I want to point out that we do have Elder Abuse Shelter. We are a sister Elder Abuse Shelter program with Sydney and ElderSAFE. And we have a few different types of shelter options, both in the community and in long-term care. And we have something that's very unique and very important for clients who may not feel safe to make phone calls. We have a live chat line that can be accessed through our website. And if you go to www.chanabaltimore.org, you'll see the time frames when the chat line is open. And we have hours during the day and as well as in the evening. So take a look, CHANA Baltimore.org. I'm really happy to be here with you.
All right, great. And we're also going to turn it over to Lynn Mckamey to introduce her program, who's also a partner of this presentation.
Hello and good afternoon to everybody. So glad to be here on a wonderful day. BC Rest is a local-wide program, Baltimore County Restoring Elder Safety Today, that helps to bring together many major stakeholders in the education and prevention of elder abuse, with aging spearheading it, but partnering with Adult Protective Services, the health department, legal aid, law enforcement, private geriatric consultants, the library, advocacy groups, and professionals as well who are concerned about the education and prevention of elder abuse. We try to help identify what is elder abuse in all the forms, how and when you can report those that are mandatory reporters, and how to best prepare for the prevention of that. Although being local, there are many, many programs that are out there that do exactly the same thing. We partner often with CHANA as well as with ElderSAFE and Sydney's programs. Although we might be bringing it forth from Baltimore County, we do want you to know that elders have the opportunity to be safe no matter where they are with the partnerships and alliances that are formed. You can always contact us at the number that you see on the screen. Our program is free and confidential and available Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 4:30. And welcome to everybody.
Great. Thank you so much, Lynn and Jackie. I'll take a moment here to just introduce the ElderSAFE Center. Some of you know us because you've been on our webinars before, but we are located in Montgomery County, Maryland, serving all of Maryland, DC, and Northern Virginia, and serving older adults throughout the community that have experienced any form of abuse, neglect, or financial exploitation. So we have a helpline as well as temporary safe shelter. And then a big part of what we do, similar to HANA, is community education, making sure professionals and older adults and community members really understand this issue of elder abuse. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. So what is elder abuse? Right, that's kind of the foundation of where we need to start this presentation. So elder abuse includes a lot of different forms of abuse. It's physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. It also includes financial, neglect, abandonment, and sometimes we also include self-neglect in that definition. And it's happening against an older person, generally in a relationship where there was some expectation of trust, right? The older adult expected to be able to trust this person, whether it was their caregiver, their son-in-law, a professional that's supposed to be taking care of them or helping them and guiding them, and then that trust becomes exploited. So in this conversation, we're going to talk about trauma and really just a new way to serve folks that we're working with, whether we know that they are survivors or victims of abuse or not, right? And kind of the overall paradigm shift we're going to have here is moving from what's wrong with you, right? What's wrong with you? Why are you doing these things, to what happened to you? So why is it so important to understand trauma? Why are we going to spend so much time in this presentation talking about what trauma is? One, because trauma is so common. As we look at the different things that can cause trauma, you'll see that's going to encompass a lot of people. So whether the person that you're working with is identifying as being a trauma survivor or an elder abuse survivor, it's likely that they might have experienced some of these different things that cause trauma. We also know that the impact of trauma is very significant. It changes people's lives, it affects their physical health, their mental health, and it changes how they approach services and how they engage with services. We also know that different service systems can often be re-traumatizing. And the way that we interact with our clients can sometimes be re-traumatizing. So that's something we're going to talk about as well, to make sure that we're serving folks and not re-triggering their trauma and hopefully helping them heal from it. All right, so what is trauma? This is the definition from SAMHSA. So trauma is the result of an event, series of events, or circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally overwhelming or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So that's a big chunk of a definition, right? So basically, trauma is an experience that is either threatening your life or maybe threatening your ability to live the life that you wanted to have. It changes the way you view the world. And here it can be one specific event, right? So being part of maybe a terrorist attack or a national disaster, or a long-term series of events or circumstances, right? So being in a domestic violence relationship for 30 or 40 years, experiencing sexual assault, bullying, isolation. I'm getting my head ahead of myself here because we're going to talk more about what that can look like. But my point is, it can be many different things, and what might cause trauma for one person is not necessarily what might cause trauma for another person. And it's important to remember that trauma is not the event, it's the experience of the event. So feel free to put in the chat box if there's anything else that you might add to this list. But these are some examples of things that could cause trauma, right? So this could be physical, sexual, financial, emotional abuse or neglect, witnessing family violence, especially at a young age, living with a family member with mental health or substance abuse issues, having a very sudden or unexplained separation from a loved one. So this could have been, when you're a child, maybe losing a parent, but also think of folks living in nursing homes right now who suddenly 2 years ago weren't able to see any of their friends or family anymore. That could have caused a lot of trauma. Be having a family member in prison, experiencing poverty, experiencing racism, discrimination, or oppression, or maybe having your family have experienced that. And we'll talk more about historical trauma. Experiencing violence in your community, war or terrorism, natural disasters. Someone added military service, absolutely. Bullying, isolation, and dementia. All of those things can cause trauma. And I'm sure we could spend the rest of the time just listing things out. But we look at the kind of really broad range of experiences here, it's very likely that the people that we're working with have experienced some of these things or maybe multiple. Okay, so I am going to take a second here. We're going to share a video, and this is a video of Anne, and Anne is going to share her story. It's a very typical example of elder abuse. And as you listen to Anne's story, I want you to think about trauma and think about her story throughout the presentation.
He had come back from
Sorry about that, everyone. I'm not sure why it's pausing. Let's try that again.
from the East Coast to Chicago and New York. His overbearing manner, the women threw him out, his friends. So he came back here, had no job, no place to live, and I said to him, I've got that room. You can stay here for 2 to 2.5 years until you get a job and get your own place. In the meantime, he was taking over the control of my mind. It got to the point where I felt about 2 inches tall. Anything that I wanted to do, I had to ask permission with my own money. I'd see something in a catalog or in a newspaper and I'd say, is it okay if I order that? He was co-signer on my bank accounts. I had my check register was messed up. He got that. When the bills came in, we had a little container where we'd put the bills in, and at the beginning of each month, we'd take the bills out, he'd look at the bills, write the check and sign it, and then have me check it before I mailed it out. I wasn't even allowed to write a check, and I knew something was wrong, but a mother's a mother. You don't want to think that way. I was unaware that he was using one of my credit cards to buy tools. He would go over to the store, buy certain tools, use my credit card. 2-3 days later, he'd go back there with the tool. It doesn't work right. And instead of putting the amount back into my account, he demanded the cash, and I gave him the cash because he was on the account. But he's, from the time he was a teenager, he was always there with his hand out. He's going to have this, that, and the other thing. So I thought, well, that's part of his personality.
Did Barry ever call you names?
No,
No.
he never used a bad name or a bad word to me. He never laid a hand on me. He was always there to help. But even taking care of this house, he took charge of it because he was planning to make it his own. He had underhandedly coerced me into signing into a reverse mortgage. I didn't understand it because the salesperson was talking to him, not to me. He also, the beginning of the year, just about 6 months before we kicked him out, had drawn up a petition. How he did it, I don't know. But he drew up a petition to have me declared incompetent and put into a home and forged my signature on it. The family said, well, he's there, he's taking care of Mom, we shouldn't bother her. Well, she calls us asking for help. I didn't feel I needed to get any help from the family, but call me once in a while. Let me know that you think about me. Well, it got to the point where he would monitor my calls, stand at the end of the one hall to make sure I didn't tell them anything, and he keeps saying, don't tell him anything, don't tell him anything. Well, it got to the point where they were afraid to say anything to me, to contact me at all. Until my blessed granddaughter talked them into coming. Let's see what's wrong with Grandma. I don't like the way things are going on. They all came together. He was there at the house, and he knew something was happening. He went in and called his daughter and son-in-law from Riverside, and they came down. And the family said, we don't like what you've been doing to Grandma or Mom. We'd like you to leave for 2 to 3 weeks till we get some stuff straightened out. So they were there. My oldest daughter came in from Phoenix and stayed with me almost a month to make sure that I was able to handle things alone. And it seemed as though all of a sudden, as soon as he was out of the house, a door opened up for me. I was no longer afraid to look around, to do things, to ask for help from people. 4 days after we kicked him out, my oldest daughter took me shopping and she reported back to the family. There's nothing wrong with Mom. She does comparative shopping. She knows how to use coupons. She knows how to handle money. She's back to where she was almost 6 years ago.
Okay. So that gives you somewhat of an idea of an example of the impact that trauma can have on folks. And that is a video that was produced by the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life, or NCAL. All right. Ooh, stop before it starts again. All right. So when we're looking at trauma, there's often an immediate physical reaction to trauma, right? And this is really hardwired into our bodies and kind of goes back to, like caveman time. So in that fight, flight, or freeze mode. We think of, imagine if we saw like this jaguar, I think this is a jaguar out in the forest, right? Our body would have a physical reaction as we prepare to hopefully live past this encounter with the jaguar. Right? So our adrenaline would start pumping, our heart's going to start beating really, really fast, which is why we have an elevated heartbeat and high blood pressure when we are stressed. We might have all of our blood kind of like pumping to our internal organs, which is why sometimes our hands get a little bit cold, right? We have that shivering or that sweating. Our breath is going to start going really fast because we're preparing to run, right? We're preparing to live past this encounter. And all of those things are really great when we're actually encountering jaguars, right? But this type of physical response is not very helpful for most pieces of stress, right? If you're someone who gets stressed going up and doing public speaking or going into an interview or an argument with someone, this physical reaction is not very helpful. And it actually becomes very, very difficult when we are, say, living with the jaguar, right? When we're in a domestic violence relationship or experiencing elder abuse and you can't get away from the person that is making you feel this way, and you're not able to stop this response, and it takes a pretty hard toll on our bodies, which we'll talk about. So some general symptoms of trauma could be having nightmares, feeling very exhausted, sadness, confusion, disorientation, right? And some of these might look a little bit like the symptoms of dementia or someone getting older, right? And we'll talk more about that, but that might be some of the reasons these things are dismissed for older adults. It could be agitation, feeling very angry, or a numbness, right? Really dissociating from what's happening. Could have hyperarousal, experiencing anxiety, depression, having flashbacks, maybe experiencing a lot of guilt or shame around what happened and maybe even denying it, not wanting to talk about it, feeling really out of control, right? A lot of times when we are experiencing trauma or having these issues, it's because what's happening to us is out of our control, right? Whether it's, an abusive person taking that control away from us or some other circumstance, we're losing the control in our lives, which is sometimes why when we're having other parts of our lives where we're losing control, it can kind of trigger back to those feelings of first experiencing the trauma. It could also be changes in appetite or really withdrawing from other people. So the impact of trauma over a lifespan can be huge, right? It actually changes our brain neurobiology. It can cause social and emotional impacts and actually increases our risk for cognitive impairments. And we also often adopt, unfortunately, coping mechanisms that aren't as helpful, right? So they might be helpful in the moment, but aren't actually long-term helpful, right? So things like smoking, using substances to feel better, eating to feel better or not eating to feel better, shopping or over shopping, gambling, right? Those things that are actually working as coping mechanisms oftentimes, but in the long term are not healthy. All right, so when we talk about trauma, especially with older adults, we definitely have to include the conversation of historical trauma. So this is when trauma is multi-generational and can be experienced by a specific cultural group. So as I talk about this, feel free to put in the chat any examples of things that might cause historical trauma. So this can be experienced by anyone living in families at one time marked by severe levels of trauma, poverty, dislocation, war, etc., and are still suffering as a result. So this is sometimes called cumulative or collective trauma. So any examples of the Holocaust? Yeah, absolutely. Slavery, Native communities being affected by boarding schools, poverty, malnourishment, transatlantic slave trade, its effects on Black people in America. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for putting those in. Yeah, those are all great examples. Refugees, communist takeover in China, gun violence. Yeah, absolutely. All of those can cause historical trauma in the folks that we're working with. All right. So in addition to historical trauma, unfortunately, people are not just experiencing often just one form of trauma, and then it's like they've reached their quota for life, right? Life is much more complicated and messy and unfair than that. So sometimes by the time we're working with folks in older age, they've experienced a lot. So I'm going to share just two hypothetical examples of older adults, and you can kind of see all the things they might have been experiencing by the time you are reaching them. So we have Sandy. She's an African-American woman born in the 1930s. So right off the bat, she has experienced racial discrimination in her life and all of this historical trauma from the discrimination her family has experienced, from slavery, from systematic oppression. When Sandy was a child, she experienced sexual abuse by her uncle, which caused isolation and rifts within her family. When she was an adult, she married a husband who was unfortunately physically abusive. And while she stayed with him for a while, she eventually left, but that caused her to really struggle financially with her and her son. And now, as she's in her 80s, her adult son still lives with her, and he is her caregiver, but he is also emotionally and financially abusive. But Sandy really blames herself for the situation because of all she put him through after leaving her husband, and feels like it's really her fault for what happened. So then I'm also going to share the story of Harold. So Harold, while he was growing up, his father was a pretty heavy drinker. He also witnessed his mother being physically abused by his father. He never really talked to anyone about it, but that was his home life. And then Harold went on to serve in Vietnam. And again, he really had this kind of culture of silence, didn't really talk to anyone about all of the horrible things he saw there and all of the people that he saw pass away. But then Harold in his 70s has a stroke. He's no longer able to drive or really be as independent as he used to be. And he has a home health aide. And then while that home health aide is helping him in some ways, she is also financially exploiting him, right? So sometimes we are reaching people just at this last box, right? And that's sometimes all we're kind of looking at. But it's important to remember that all these other things are part of that story and influencing the way they interact with us and how we need to serve them. So the long-term effects of trauma, right? Trauma that either is very long going, right? You know, a domestic violence situation, long-term family violence, or trauma that we've really never been able to heal from can have really long-term effects on our body. It can cause heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, right? If you think of those high heart rates, that high blood pressure after a long time, that's going to have a serious effect on your body. It can cause long-term sleep disturbances, depression, anxiety. It can also cause chronic pain. So if you've ever been a little bit stressed out and you notice that your muscles ache, right? Or you're kind of holding yourself in a little bit tighter than normal, right? A lot of times our stomach hurts, our neck hurts, our back hurts when we're stressed. Well, imagine that for a very, very, very long time. And that's going to eventually cause long-term chronic pain. We also see suicidality, thinking and behavior in folks that have experienced trauma. And I know in our program, we've definitely seen an uptick in that in terms of calls. It can also cause poor social or familial relationships, right? So kind of going back to that story of Sandy, right? The abuse that she experienced by her uncle might have caused some issues within her family to cause them to separate. Her husband in the domestic violence relationship might have tried to isolate her from other friends and family. So maybe before she was able to leave him, she kind of got separated from her close family. And now maybe she, in her later years, she really only has her son, who is abusive, but he's all she has. And then these unhealthy coping mechanisms can certainly take a toll on us. So how might this actually show up in our clients, right? These are the things that we're seeing. Well, I want you to remember all of that stuff that's behind it, right? So this might be a client that's very distrustful of you, even if you've shown them no reason to be distrustful. I have someone that I work with, it's through a volunteer program. So I talk to her twice a week, and we've been talking twice a week for almost 3 years. If I call her just an hour late, she will think that I am done with her, that we're never going to talk again, that I've completely abandoned her, right? And, you know, I might think, gosh, I've done so much to build this trust with her. I've been so consistent, right? But it's not about me. It's not about our relationship. It's about all the things that have happened to her in the past. It could be hyper arousal or being very easily startled, right? So someone who's kind of jumping when they see something, triple, quadruple checking that they locked the doors at night, or that the windows are locked, or their car is locked. Someone who has difficulty with change, or maybe really needing to feel in control and feeling distressed when they lose that control, right? And for a lot of us, in the aging services field, we're meeting people at a time in their life where they are losing some control sometimes in terms of independence. And then that can trigger back to all of those times when they didn't have control. It could be difficulty making decisions, or maybe having very strong reactions to things that don't quite make sense, right? So they don't make sense to us, but that's because they're triggering that person, right? They're smelling something, they're hearing something, they're seeing something that's reminding them of this trauma, and they're reacting in a way that feels very disproportionate to the situation, right? And again, we're thinking, oh my gosh, what's wrong with you? When we need to be asking, what happened to you? So it could be difficulty regulating those emotions, someone who's feeling irritable or agitated all the time, or again, someone who's using substances or has some of these less healthy behaviors, and they're doing those things as a coping mechanism. So a lot of the folks that we're working with might also be experiencing dementia or some level of cognitive impairment. So first off, a trauma history actually significantly impacts the way that we age and can influence dementia and make it more common. We also know that symptoms of trauma can be confused with cognitive decline, right? So if I went into work and I was feeling very confused and very disoriented and having trouble kind of making sense of things, feeling really tired and irritable, my coworkers are not going to say, well, Sydney's just getting older, right? They're going to check in on me. They're going to figure out what's going on. Family or friends would do the same thing. But unfortunately, sometimes we see these trauma symptoms with older adults and we confuse them and think that it's just about age. We also know that sometimes trauma symptoms become more severe as we get older and can pop up a lot more with dementia, right? So someone might be unfortunately having to relive these trauma experiences due to their memory loss and where they are in kind of the dementia journey. So re-traumatization, this is when the trauma is over and done with. The experience is over, but something re-triggers that, right? So triggers is probably a word that you've heard before, and this could be a smell, right? So maybe we're going to go back to the story of Sandy. Maybe Sandy is walking somewhere and she smells a cologne, and it's the same cologne that her uncle used to wear, right? And suddenly she is right back in that moment of experiencing sexual violence by her uncle, right? And our bodies are smart, but they're not that smart. And unfortunately, sometimes they have trouble realizing, hey, that threat is gone. I don't need to be concerned about that anymore. And we get right back into those physical responses of trauma. But triggers are super specific. So that, Jackie and I could experience the same exact horrible situation, and what triggers her is going to be completely different than what triggers me. Or maybe I'll have no triggers and she'll have lots of trauma post, right? So trauma is so specific for the person. So really, when we're working with folks, we want to focus more on the process of what's going on than the goals. So this is just an example of re-traumatization and things that could happen either in the systems that we work within or in our relationships. Right? So do you have a situation set up where survivors have to continually retell their story, right? To the helpline person, and then to the advocate, and then to the police officer. And before you know it, they've had to tell this same terrible, terrible story 10 times. Do they feel like they're treated like a number within your organization? Are there procedures, that require disrobing or not really having control of their bodies or what happens to their bodies? Do you make sure not to treat people as a label, right? Are we saying, calling people, you know, this homeless person, this schizophrenic person, this addict, or are we looking at them as the whole person? Do they have choice and independence in the service and the treatment? And do they have ability to give feedback about the service delivery? And then in individual relationships that you have with people, it could be not feeling like they're being seen or heard, violations of trust, failure to ensure emotional safety, relationships that aren't collaborative, doing things for someone rather than with them, right? Sometimes I'm sure most people on this call, we're helpers, right? But is our helping actually hurting by kind of taking that control away from someone else? Or are we using punitive treatments or coercive language? All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Jackie to give our first case example of Cornell.
So we're going to have a little bit of a chat conversation. I'm going to read this case example of Cornell to everyone, and then ask a few questions and hear your thoughts about this situation that Cornell is in. Cornell is 84 years old. He lives in the home that he's owned since 1953. His daughter Adelaide and her husband Isaac moved in with him 3 months ago and are taking over his entire life. They sold their cars and now use his. They tell him he should ask them for a ride when he needs to go somewhere, but they never seem to have time to take him anywhere. Adelaide tells him to make her the representative payee of his Social Security check to make it easier for her to pay their household expenses. Shortly thereafter, Adelaide tells her father that she doesn't have any money, that Isaac lost all his money in the stock market, so they need to use Cornell's money to pay all their bills. Cornell is reminded of his childhood when his mother didn't have enough money to pay their bills after his father died. He remembers them having to stay with his mother's friend, and he vowed to never have anything like that happen when he grew up. Cornell is anxious and confused. Adelaide and Isaac convince him to let them take care of his checkbook and paying all the bills. Cornell tells them he wants to move to a senior apartment where he could be around more people, but Adelaide says there's no money. When Cornell asks about his money, Adelaide threatens to put him into a nursing home. Adelaide is now attending Cornell's church and is telling everyone, including the pastor, that Cornell is really losing it, and she's not sure what to do. So in the chat, why don't you share with us what may have been upsetting for Cornell in this situation? Just take a minute and let us know what your ideas are about this. And also think about what assumptions you might actually be making, assumptions that you might be making about this situation.
So a lot of chat about losing his independence, losing his control, things that have happened early in childhood coming back up. So the trauma about money, being ignored, isolation, being taken advantage of by his children, assumption, it's going so fast, I can't even read them all. Assumption that he might, in fact, not be able to manage his funds.
Scared of his future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And do you think you might be making any assumptions about this situation?
Someone said that there's an assumption that they are taking advantage of him, or an assumption that he prefers to do things himself.
You also have one hand raised.
Yes, we're not able to unmute folks just due to the number on the call. So if you want to just put that in the chat, that would be great.
Return to poverty, lack of funds, fear of that. Mm-hmm. And if you were the pastor, how might you respond to Adelaide when you heard this this story that Cornell is really losing it and she's not sure what to do. Make a home visit. Go visit him. Tell me more why you think he's losing it. Yeah. Do you think that Cornell might be experiencing complex trauma?
Got a lot of yeses.
Do you think he might be experiencing re-traumatization?
Lots of yeses.
And what types of trauma triggers do you think Cornell may have been experiencing, if any?
Depression, remembering his mother, being without money, lack of income, poverty, childhood poverty, loss, anxiety over money, grief and anger, remembering a lack of voice. That's a great one. Loss of safety, having to live outside of his home, move again without his consent.
Constant insecurity.
Mm-hmm.
So next slide. And next slide. How are we going to help our clients who are being harmed? One thing that Sydney and I talked about in preparing for today is that we hear in the field this notion of being trauma informed. But really being trauma informed, we could be trauma informed from now till doomsday, but does that mean that we're actually going to change the way that we respond when we're in the field working with a client, or maybe even listening to a friend or a family member, or especially a coworker? So working in a trauma responsive way does not require disclosure of trauma. Rather, there's a recognition of the need for safety on the part of the client, physical and emotional safety, and for that client to be able to have choice and control in the decisions that are going to be made that will affect any kind of treatment that that client is going to receive. And above all, we don't want to use any confrontational approaches at all. Next slide. So what do we do? And I want to reiterate, not only should you be thinking about what do we do for our clients, but think about your workplace. We know that the data says that of all women throughout their lifetime, 1 in 4 will experience some form of abuse, and that 1 in 7 men will experience some form of abuse. And abuse is only one way that a person might be traumatized. So we're working with people, many people who also are experiencing or have experienced trauma and may be triggered. So we want to make sure that we set up calm and nurturing environments when we talk with our clients, meet with them. And in the workplace, we want to make sure that our staff are being trained to meticulously observe for triggers in our clients when someone's beginning to move from a calm, continuous state to a discrete state of emergency. We want to train everyone to be caring and compassionate, and we want to make any adjustments in the environment that we think might be needed for our clients to feel more comfortable. We want to look at ourselves and our behaviors and actions as the key for success. We're really in a leadership position when we're interviewing clients, when we're working with clients, and clients who have been traumatized have learned to be hypervigilant. And so that doesn't only mean hypervigilant with the people around them who they think are abusing them or are abusing them, but hypervigilant to how all of the professionals as well are working with them. Next slide. So again, it's likely that some or many of us are working with other people who have been experienced trauma. I'm going to keep saying that because I want really all of us to be thinking about this as not just unidirectional professionals to clients, but also professionals with professionals. So we want to think about the importance of relationships. Relationships that are healthy and unhealthy is really the field of the work that we're talking about when we're talking about elder abuse. And we can unintentionally cause those people that we're serving to relive their trauma. And that's the very last thing that we're aiming to do, is to bring more harm. So we want to think about what hurts, and what does hurt are interactions that can be humiliating or disrespectful, critical, judgmental, condemning somebody for not showing up for an appointment or not following our, expert advice in how they can be safe. But instead, what helps is to express kindness and patience and reassurance in a very calm and accepting way. We want to be listeners, not listeners only for what people are saying, but what they're not saying, what their bodies are saying, what we're perceiving about them, making sure we check out what we're perceiving. Really, even the use of words like please and thank you can set a tone that begins to bring safety for someone who's been abused. Next slide. And, as I've been mentioning about coworkers, we also want to be very considerate of what are the policies and procedures in our organizations that might be trauma informed, trauma responsive, but also might unintentionally cause those that we're serving to relive their trauma. So ask your supervisors, ask your managers, do we have written policies and procedures for elder abuse? Do we have policies and procedures beyond reporting as a mandated reporter? Everyone here is likely to be a mandated reporter of any kind of abuse. What other types of policies and procedures does our organization have? And without knowing those, it's difficult, I think, to really provide safe response to someone who discloses to you that they're being abused. So you want to make sure that rules that always seem to be broken, are there policies regarding those rules? And are there policies and procedures that focus on organizational needs rather than in addition to client needs? What types of documentation is required and written in policy that involves minimally and to a larger degree involvement of our clients? Sometimes as new employees, new staff, we're unsure about these sorts of things. And sometimes in crisis, we might want to just take over as the professional rather than involving our clients. And our clients are the ones who know better than we, better than anyone, what will be safe for them and what won't be safe for them. So we want to make sure that we're not requiring things of them that will bring harm, that they know will bring harm. We want them to have a voice with us. What hurts is language and cultural barriers when we don't know where resources are to help us, if we don't know the language and the culture of the people that we're working with. And there are resources for us to turn to. So it's important during and later an orientation in your organization, maybe an annual review of what types of resources are available. And managers, supervisors, making sure that you're always providing that kind of detail to your staff. So what does help? You can see transparency and documentation and service planning, making sure that materials that you want to hand over to your clients are in that person's language, continually seeking feedback from clients about their experience. Next slide.
Jackie, we just
And
had a
all-
quick question in the chat before you move on about some examples of good policies and procedures that are kind of focusing on the client.
Well, one would be that you involve your client in planning. Another, and we're going to talk about this more later when we talk about reporting, we want to make sure that we have a policy about how we let our clients know that we're going to make a report, letting them know when we very first meet them that we are mandated reporters and under what circumstances we are required to report and how we will help them. If the situation does involve needing to report prior to reporting, we'll make sure that we have a safety plan in place with them, one that they are involved in creating, not one that we're making for them and telling them what to do. Yeah. I see there's something else in the chat. Is that another question?
No, that's the same question I just asked you. So thank you.
Can I just piggyback one more second on that? With that, Jackie, if you're not a mandatory reporter, explaining what your role can be in helping to problem solve and bring safety and how you can assist with getting it to the appropriate entity or to a mandatory reporting platform so the issue does not kind of fall where it lays if that is not within your status that is mandatory, but what role you can play for safety.
Thank you. Thanks, Lynn. So also the importance of our attitudes and our own beliefs. We can unintentionally cause people we're serving to relive their trauma by our own biases, by our own isms. I think a great training that we might do in the future, Sydney, would be to help people get in touch with their ageism and their internal biases, because we're all of us, we're being bombarded all the time with signs, jokes, language that teach us unintentionally and unconsciously how we are to think about old people. And so we end up treating people based on those messages that we receive, even though those messages are not really true. So we want to be very cognizant of where we are individually about how we feel about old people, what we think about old people having sex. And when I say old people, I mean people 50 and older. And our feelings and our beliefs might change throughout the older adult lifespan. We might have different attitudes about and expectations of how we think an 85-year-old should behave versus a 50-year-old. But 85-year-olds do have relationships. They do have new relationships. They do create new work in their lives. They reinvent themselves. Not all older people are frail and helpless. And so we want to be in touch with our own beliefs about that, because even though we might not be saying it, we are exuding, we are amplifying, we are transmitting our attitudes and beliefs about older people when we're working with them. So one question that we started our presentation with is, what's wrong with this person, rather than what happened to you? Would you like to tell us or tell me what happened to you? Is a very different tone in that question. More than words, there's a tone. And so also what hurts is regarding a person's difficulties only as symptoms, rather than they aren't their symptoms, they're experiencing symptoms. There's a lot more of a whole person that you're working with, that you're building a relationship with, that you're getting to know, than just the idea that they have a mental health problem right now, or they're having a medical problem right now, because we all experience these things. It doesn't mean that there's something bad about them or less than, because that's being human. So what helps Is asking questions for the purpose of understanding those harmful events that contributed to their current situation, and recognizing that symptoms might really be coping strategies and adaptations, and that those coping strategies, those symptoms might actually be strengths rather than weaknesses that have ultimately over time come to harm that person without them even really intending for that to happen. Next slide. So there are 5 tenets for providing care through a trauma-informed responsive lens. And they are trauma awareness, safety, respect, control, and choice, and using a strengths-based approach. And these, this applies also for volunteers. So if you have a cadre of volunteers in your organization, I want to encourage you to provide training to them about how to be trauma responsive, how to wear that sort of lens. And by the way, we always like to encourage everyone when you're working with older people to wear an elder abuse lens as well, because elder abuse is a very hidden problem. And people will tell us that they're being abused in ways that are indirect. And so if we wear that lens, we can approach our meetings with them as if there is the real possibility that they could be being abused, and that will come out, perhaps that will come out in the course of building a safe relationship. Next slide. So trauma awareness is about all the things that I just have been talking about. Providing care through this lens involves understanding, anticipating, responding to the impact that trauma can have, and continuing to build increased awareness on how to address the existing trauma and to prevent re-traumatization. Trauma interferes with a sense of time. So be prepared to have older adults who have experienced abuse forget appointments, forget meetings, act as if they're confused about why they're there. Trauma interferes with information processing. So a challenge which may or may not be compounded by aging is this confusion. And it's not necessarily an indication of cognitive impairment or even cognitive decline. So when I asked before, what assumptions might we be making when we heard about Cornell, we might be making an assumption about older adults who present as if they're having cognitive decline or impairment, as if they actually do, when it would be better to have those clients evaluated rather than making the assumption. And you could just as easily make the assumption that they've experienced trauma, and you would be missing an important medical bit of information about how they're doing. Trauma can shut down speech centers of the brain that can make it profoundly difficult for older adults to find language for what has happened to them. So at CHANA, it's very common that we might meet with somebody for 5, 6, 7 times before they actually tell us their story. Or they might tell us a little bit of their story for why they're coming initially, but it might take that many times before they actually tell us some of the key events that will help us to help them the most. And so, working with elder abuse clients means that we have to be patient. We have to integrate our knowledge about trauma into every meeting that we have with them. And we have to provide education for them about the trauma once they tell us about it, letting them know, reminding them that there's no normal response to trauma, and that having a hard time describing what happened or even telling us what happened is very common and very normal. And so having trouble verbalizing the nature of the trauma You want to be paying attention to other cues that they might be giving. For example, agitation, or a sudden onset of memory challenges, or all of a sudden they might become angry, or there might be some sexualized behaviors that are sort of out of the blue that you wouldn't be expecting. And if you begin to feel uncomfortable, you want to, after your meeting with that person, you really want to spend time with yourself and think about, how did I respond in that interview or in that meeting with that person? And what is going on with me that might have been a trauma trigger, or that I want to address further so that I can be of better service and respect what's happening with that person. There might even be an expression of ambivalence, like as if they don't really want to be active in their treatment. And that might not really be true. They might want nothing more than to be very active and take some reins and be in control about their treatment. You know, when Sydney was giving some examples of some trauma triggers, there could be things like the temperature in the room, or it could be the color of the shirt that you're wearing, or somebody else in the room is wearing. And that may seem to others to be so irrelevant, but there is a concern for ongoing and recent trauma that follows these kinds of sensory details that are re-traumatizing somebody, because the body remembers where the brain might not or cannot. The body does remember. And so let's see, what else do I want to tell you about this? I guess I want to reiterate good self-care. And in those policies and procedures, an example might be, I remember when I first came to CHANA, one of the things that my boss said to me at that time was, if I see written on your calendar that you have a therapy appointment, I'm going to be applauding you. And I thought that was the most unusual thing I had ever heard. But in actuality, to do a good job, not only do I need to come to a webinar like this, but I need to maintain my own well-being, to provide direct crisis response, and to hear trauma stories day in and day out. I really do have to take care of myself. This is a safety issue. And it's a safety issue for me personally, professionally, and it's a safety issue for our clients in order for us to be able to respond to them in the healthiest way for them. Next slide. And so speaking of safety, you know, I think that we start out ground zero, making an assumption that our trauma surviving clients feel unsafe. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of internal work, therapeutic work, to go through healing after trauma and after re-traumatization. And so we want to just basically think, okay, these people that we're working with, they're not going to feel safe when we're working with them. It's going to take a while. Eventually, they hopefully will, and we'll be able to know it because they'll call us in the midst of something, or they'll tell us more than they had ever told us before. But we don't want to make assumptions that everything is copacetic, because when they call, if they're not disclosing, they might actually be in that moment in current danger. And so we're always needing to think that this person is either now or yesterday or the night before, or when we hang up the phone, going to be in danger. And this trustworthiness and transparency doesn't just build emotional safety, it builds physical safety as well. And then that has a long-reaching effect. If you're with a client, you want to be very conscious of your physical proximity to them, what your body language is, you don't want to just touch someone. You don't want to be too close. I say, use the, with the pandemic, we said, stay 6 feet away. I think, 3 to 6 feet, 3 feet is approximately an arm's length, from shoulder to the tip of your middle finger on your hand, stretched straight out. So you want to think about a 3 to 6 feet distance, and you want to talk slowly, but you want to talk loudly. You want to make sure that the tone in your voice is conveying that you're patient and that you care about them and that you care about being with them and that you want to help them feel safe. Next slide. So this is safety. And then this next tenet is respect. Trauma's impact on memory and speech and executive function, can not only have a client appear to be disorganized, but also inconsistent. And that can make us feel frustrated and like we've spent all this time trying to help them, and why we've gotten them to a certain point. Why now are they sort of backpedaling? And it's not uncommon to work with somebody for months and think that now they're at this point where they are going to leave, or they're going to get a protective order or something. And then they make the decision right on the day when that's going to happen that they're not ready and they're not going to do it. And we have to respect where that person is at, what their timing is. And if their disclosure starts to change, also believe them. Believe that they're trying to do their best, and that what they're telling you is true, and that when they're changing their story all the time, think that they're upset, they're afraid, they don't know what's going to happen to them. They want to make sure that you're telling them what's going to happen to them before they take these steps, and what will happen to the person who they're telling you is harming them before they take these steps. And you always want to be right there whenever they're reaching out to you. You want to be right there. You want to show the consistency for them. So you want to be listening instead of fixing, and you go at their pace. Also, if you're younger than the person that you're providing services for, this can be tricky. So you want to find a balance between extending appropriate deference and a respect to them, and interacting with them as if they're a peer of yours. And I would say, talk with your supervisor and your coworkers. I would make this a lunch and learn topic. I would make it a topic during a clinical staff meeting if you're feeling like that you're having some concerns about that. Next slide. Control and choice is everything. Elder abuse survivors have been controlled. It's the hallmark of abuse, is having power and control taken away from you, an abuser having power and control over you. So you want to help your clients feel empowered in every way possible. I would say Google the word empowerment and look for examples of how you can empower yourself and how you can empower other people. Believe in resiliency. Believe that people are resilient and that they change, they can change, even up until the very last parts of their lives. People do change. So you want to explain to them everything that you're doing, and why you're asking them the questions that you're asking, what you're going to do with the information that they tell you. So you want to let them know directly that they have choice. You don't want to assume that they realize that just because they've called you or reached out to you, that they have choice. You want to explicitly tell them. And another reason why it's so important is because for some older people, they're losing mobility. They're losing parts of their lives. People identity. They can lose control just as part of natural aging. And so trauma-informed care and response includes how to help people maintain or gain control in ways that are fitting for them now, not how things would have been for them 10 years ago or 5 years ago or last year. So you can explore with them, ask them what would work for them, what kind of controls would they like to have in their lives now. Next slide. And you want to take a strengths-based approach rather than a deficit-oriented approach, rather than focusing on people's real or imagined limitations or diminishing capabilities. A trauma-responsive approach focuses on skill building and resilience. So you want to be asking them, what are they able to do? And even if they in what ways are they able? Even if they're in a wheelchair or they use a walker, ask them, how do you get around? What kinds of transportation work best for you? Do you have everything set up in your home so that you feel safe there? You can take care of yourself there. We have a lot of resources in Maryland now for helping people to make their homes much more accessible for them to have independence. So there's that. Trustworthy and transparency, I've already talked a lot about. Ageism can really include anything from laughing at an old geezer joke to not providing mental or physical health care to an older person because you hold a belief that they'll never change. Or you might say to yourself, and this is something that abusers do, well, they're going to die anyway. She's going to die anyway. This is going to be mine. It's going to be my money. It's going to be my house. I need it now. I might as well use it now, take it over now. She's not going to know any difference anyway. This is very much not a strengths-based restorative approach. So we want to be reframing maladaptive coping, any kind of coping, any kind of maladaptation into how can this really be resilience? How can this be a mark of a starting point for improvement, change? What does this person want? Okay, let's go to the next slide.
All right, go
ahead.
Okay, so this is me for a little bit, and I'm going to go quickly through these. That way Jackie has time to talk about reporting. But we want to be using empowering language when we're talking with our clients and also about our clients, right? And I think the first one here, we have older adult versus senior or versus elderly. And I think the important part about language is the language that one person finds very respectful is sometimes different than the language that somebody else finds respectful, right? I have been in big meetings where, an older person has jumped up and called out their elected official for using the term senior and saying that they were being extremely disrespectful by using the term senior, that they should be using the term older adult. And then I've had other older people who say, no, I love the term senior. It feels empowering. It's incredible that I made it to this age. So just consider the words that you're using and how you're describing people, and also kind of go by what they are saying, right? When we talk about survivor versus victim, for some people, victim is very, very disempowering to use. But for other people, we've had folks in our program who've said, I don't feel like I've gotten through this yet. I'm not a survivor yet. I still feel like a victim, right? When we're talking about being scammed, are you seeing things like they fell for it, they were duped, right? Or they experienced a scam, right? When we're talking about the person who's doing harm in this relationship, are you seeing things like, well, tell me what your abuser said, or what is the perpetrator's relationship with you, right? That's very, very difficult language to use when that person is probably their loved one, their son, their husband, their daughter. So maybe something like this person causing you harm, or this person that you're in an abusive relationship with. Of course, we want to use kind of person first language as opposed to addict, as opposed to homeless person. We want a person experiencing X. And when in doubt, use the language that is used by the client. We want to be inclusive in our language, right? So if you are talking to a survivor and you've automatically moved into, well, this is a woman in front of me. If her partner is doing the abuse, he must be a man, right? Then you've already potentially alienated this person. So we want to think about that, not just in our conversations with people, but also in our materials, right? If someone were coming across your program, either online or in brochures, would they see their experiences and their culture and themselves reflected in those materials? Would they see themselves reflected in your staff, right? Ask yourselves who would feel welcome coming here and who might not feel welcome coming here, and what can I do to make sure all of those people know that they are welcome. And one great way to do that is to see, well, if my community has, this demographic, but I'm only hitting part of it, that could be kind of a big sign of who you are not signaling that welcomeness to. And then Jackie already talked a lot about ageism and myths around aging, so I'm not going to get too much into that. But other myths around elder abuse that we don't want to continue to perpetuate are the caregiver stress myth, right? This idea that it's just caregivers getting too stressed out, and we end up giving too many services to the caregiver and nothing to the older adult that's actually experiencing the abuse. Sometimes, and I hope none of you all on this call feel this way, but there's this idea that elder abuse isn't actually as serious as other forms of family violence or other forms of violence. When I actually first started my position at ElderSAFE, I was previously doing domestic violence work with younger adults. And I had someone say, oh, well, that won't be nearly as depressing as your last job. And I said, no, it's elder abuse. And they said, yeah, but that's just like neglect, right? And one, it's much more than neglect. But for those of you that have seen serious neglect cases, that can be deadly for people. It's very, very serious. We want to remember that even folks with cognitive impairments can still accurately report abuse. And again, these last 2 points are to things Jackie has already talked about, that older adults can still have active romantic sexual lives, that their lives are not over just because they've reached a certain age, and that depression is not a normal part of the aging process and not something that we should just ignore. All right, so with that, I'm going to make sure we have some time to talk about reporting. Jackie, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, so some of you already know what Adult Protective Services is. For those of you who don't, it's one of the adult services, one of many adult services programs of your local Department of Social Services. I know that there are some people here from other states and outside of Maryland, so you will have your own laws. You'll need to look those up. But the purpose of Adult Protective Services in Maryland is to provide investigative services to remedy or prevent the abuse, neglect, self-neglect, exploitation of vulnerable adults who are unable to protect their own interests and are at risk of immediate harm to their own person or to others. Vulnerable adult has a very specific definition. A vulnerable adult, and that this is very important because most older people become vulnerable at some point or other in some way, shape, or form. But in the case of Adult Protective Services and the law, it means a person who is aged 18 or over, who lacks the physical or mental capacity to provide for their daily needs. Again, this is a very stringent definition. Many older people are mistreated and exploited, but aren't considered vulnerable adults because they can handle their daily needs, and they still might not be able to extricate themselves from abusive relationships. And a lot of times older people move from one dependent relationship to another, and even if they are not vulnerable. So next slide. So this is the code for Maryland, and you can see in this code who are the mandated reporters. It's all health practitioners, all police officers, and all human service workers. So you don't have to be a social worker only to be a human service worker. Also, anyone can report elder abuse by contacting the local department. You don't have to be a health practitioner, police officer, or human service worker to make the report. Does that make sense? So you have to, you're mandated if you're one of those, but you're not mandated, and you can if you're not one of those. Next.
So Jackie, one second. Lynn is going to just jump in to mention the role of the Ombudsman in addition to Adult Protective Services.
Great.
Yeah, just to piggyback on, if someone is an older adult or an adult that is in a long-term care setting, nursing home, or an assisted living, and there is abuse or allegations of inappropriate care, the opportunity to contact the Ombudsman via the Department of Aging program would probably be a primary go-to, as opposed to Adult Protective Services that would be responding to those abuse cases for those that live in the community. Sometimes there's a little gray area when it's an assisted living abuse call, so you might go either way with Adult Protective Services or the Ombudsman, but just wanted our participants to know that APS probably would not have the primary role in your long-term nursing home settings.
There are also other places where you can report abuse. One is the Maryland Department of Health, if the person is in a long-term care facility or an assisted living facility. There's also the Office of the Attorney General. They actually have a specialized elder abuse Medicaid fraud unit. And it used to be that they would only investigate elder abuse when there was Medicaid fraud in a nursing home. But now they will investigate when there is somebody who is providing care that's a Medicaid recipient. So those are two additional places that you can think about reporting, as well as the Office of Healthcare Quality. If a person is in a facility, it's really, really advised that you contact your local ombudsman office. And there's one in just about every jurisdiction. We have a strong network in Maryland of ombudsmen. Next slide. And I want you to know that as a reporter, you are protected. The law protects you. Next slide. The law protects you, and it says any person who is in good faith makes or participates in making a report under this subtitle, or participates in an investigation or a judicial proceeding resulting from a report under this subtitle, is immune from any civil liability that would otherwise result. So you don't want to be concerned that you'll carry any liability if you make this report. You're protected. Next slide, please. There's something in the chat. Do we want to respond to that? Let's see. To report suspected cases of abuse, there's a phone number here. And is this the APS number, Candy? And which one? And in what jurisdiction are you, Candy? Baltimore City. Okay. And then real briefly, Lynn, do you want to say what the role is of an ombudsman?
Sure. The Ombudsman provides advocacy for problem solving for those that live in nursing homes and assisted livings free of charge. And the problem solving can range from the type of care that you're receiving, staffing issues or concern, communication, all the way to the realms of alleged abuse or neglect that's happening in the nursing home or assisted living setting. And there are 21 jurisdictions where the ombudsmen are located all throughout Maryland. In your local jurisdiction. So if you call one and your home site or the site you have a question about is not exactly in that area, they can definitely do a warm handoff to the appropriate location. So again, the concern or question doesn't fall through. We do provide education as well. It may not be a complaint or a concern, but it might be just getting more access to information and regulations which guide the long-term care settings and what does that mean for your loved one or for you who's actually admitted to the site, and the best care plan that could be provided as well, or therapy plan.
Great, thanks. So, you know, we are doing this today in commemoration of World Elder Abuse Awareness Day through BC Rest. And we thought that only an hour and a half would be just enough for everyone to be able to tolerate being on Zoom. So one of the things that's very important when thinking about reporting is safety planning for that client, with that client, which we don't have time today to go through. We want to leave just a couple of minutes for some questions. So this will be the last thing that I share. You want to make sure that you're not mandated to let the client know or the family know that you're going to report. You don't have to do that, but depending on the situation, it may be advisable. And so if you know that you're going to be making reports, I would say talk with your supervisors and learn about how to create safety plans, or contact a victim advocacy organization such as CHANA, such as ElderSAFE, and or even at the state's attorney's office, which, by the way, is another place that you can report to. There is a victim advocate at the state's attorney's office. Learn how to create safety plans and learn how to safety plan with your clients. It's a critical component when you're going to be reporting, because you want to make sure that your reporting isn't putting that client in greater danger of lethality. So again, you know, ask in your organizations either to be trained on how to do this or contact one of our organizations when you want to involve a victim advocate. We have amazing victim advocates at CHANA who have been with us for a very long time. We have social workers, and we have legal advocates who will go to court with people to get protective orders and peace orders, even at night if that's needed. And I think let's stop there, Sydney. What do you think? Take some questions.
Yeah, so while we, safety plans, sorry, I was just reading Lynn's comment here. Safety plans can be robust or very simple, as long as they're addressing the issue at hand. So please feel free to put any questions or comments that you have for all of us in the chat box. While we wait for those, I will just remind folks, if you are interested in getting a social work CEU for this training, please fill out the evaluation that will come in your follow-up email. You can request an evaluation, or you can request a certificate there. If you haven't already, please use this time to make sure that your name showing up on Zoom is your actual full name, because in order to get that credit, I need to show that you have completed the entire live presentation, and we will be sending out a copy of this afterwards. So thank you all so much for coming. I'm not seeing any questions here, but we will give you all of our, these are all resources we have. Oh, I do see a hand raised. Frida, if you're able to put your question in the chat box, that would be great. So we have some resources for you all, as well as our contact information.
Rita, if you can hear, check your email, and then I can put your chat in the question if need be before we check off, because we see your hand raised, but we can't unmute you. And I did send you an email.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. We'll stay on the line if anybody has any of those last minute questions, but have a good day, and we appreciate you all joining us.
Thank you so much, everyone. Stay well.